Today is June 2nd, 2023, and we welcome you to our edition of the Chapter 49 podcast. We're very happy you've chosen to join us today and spend a little of your valuable time with us. My name is Larry Lannon. I'm a retiree, and I do communications volunteer work for Chapter 49. And once again, I want to welcome our chapter president, Duncan Giles. Good to have you back, Duncan.
As always, Larry, good to be here.
And if you're watching on video, you can see we do have a guest this week. Very timely because we are recording this at the early morning of June the 2nd. Just hours ago, the Senate has passed a debt ceiling agreement, which we want to talk about in some detail. So we are very fortunate to have, for a second time on our podcast, Kata, Sybenga, the legislative and political director for NTEU's national office in Washington. So Kata Sybenga, welcome once again. It's great to have you back.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
And we want to just jump right in. We're going to talk about a lot of things about your department, what goes on there. But because we have breaking news at the moment, I do want to just get your view off the top on this debt ceiling agreement. Maybe talk about why this debt ceiling was such an important issue. I think an awful lot of people in the public and even members of NTEU are a little confused about just what it is and why it was so important. Maybe just a brief idea of that, an idea of why it was so important and why the agreement was important to be passed by the Congress, and we'll talk about more about the impact later, but just give us a quick view on that, if you would.
Sure. So, I mean, the debt ceiling is, I'm sure most people have probably heard talk about it a lot lately, but really what it is it's raising the debt ceiling is about making sure the country honors its debts, right? So it's making sure we can pay our bills, and so Treasury has to borrow money to pay those bills generally, because we have not always enough revenue coming in the right timing. And so that's a pretty normal thing they do, I think, daily. But it's really about making sure that we can keep our credit rating intact. It keeps the global economy stable, and it makes sure that we can pay our bills. And we've done this many times over the years. Congress, I think it's happened, many times for at least the last, 75 years, I think. So this is something that we have come up occasionally, and generally Congress does it pretty quickly. Occasionally, like this time, we get into a little bit more of a debate about it. And this time, we really did have some in Congress who wanted to push for funding cuts in exchange for raising this debt limit. And, one of the things we've been saying is that they should not be trying to cut funding to our agencies, obviously, but especially because these things are really separate. We have, raising the debt limit doesn't increase federal spending. It's not spending money that Congress hasn't already appropriated. It's really making sure that government pays for purchases it's already made. And so we think these should be separate conversations. We understand that Congress has this power of the purse, right? They're going to every year talk about how much funding each agency is going to get. Every year, we're going to be pushing for more of it, because most of the time our agencies and our members feel that their agencies need more. But we're, these should be separate conversations. And so that's where we have been through this conversation and through this debate. But obviously, in the end, folks dug in their heels, and these conversations happened a bit together. And that's where we were over last weekend when they announced this deal that now has passed.
And again, just hours ago, the Senate passed the same measure the House did. It goes to the president and more certainly it'll get his signature and be enacted into law. Next question from Duncan Giles.
I just want to back up exactly what you were saying. Our feeling has been all along, you don't play chicken with the debt ceiling. And so this is something that greatly has irritated me. Were you surprised at the bipartisan nature in the end that this took on?
In the end, because the president made the deal with Speaker McCarthy, I think they both kind of had to pull their people together to make sure it passed. And nobody wanted, I don't know for sure about some of the House Republicans probably would have liked to embarrass Speaker McCarthy further, but and some tried to. But in general, I think there was consensus that folks would come together to at least find enough to pass it, because it really is catastrophic for the economy if this doesn't happen. And so once they did come to some sort of agreement, and it's obviously not one that everybody's happy with, and that's what compromise is. When you have a compromise, you're never going to have somebody who's like, I got everything I wanted. We certainly weren't thrilled with everything in that, and I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit more. But and I know, even President Biden has said he wasn't thrilled with everything in there, but you make these agreements because this is something that absolutely must happen. And if this is the only way to get it done, you're going to get some agreement to do that.
I want to ask about this question because we'll get into the IRS impact in a moment. There's been an awful lot of spin on this, and I think we'd like to get to the facts, and I think you can do that. But before we do that, I think one thing that impacts the entire federal workforce would be pay raises. Right now, we don't know how this debt ceiling will impact pay raises for federal employees. You and your staff, what are you hearing about this, if anything?
Well, I mean, the debt limit agreement doesn't directly impact pay, right? But it does put some limits on spending over the next few years. So it's not as large a cap on spending as we were worried about, as what the House Republicans passed in their bill in April. That would have been significant cuts to spending, taking us back to 22 levels, I believe it was. And so, we will have, though, some limited spending at agencies, and part of agency budgets are how they pay their employees, right? So as pay is set every year by the president, or at least it's first proposed by the president, the pay raise for the following year. And so he has already put out that it is 5.2% that he's proposed for next year. He hasn't said how much of that is across the board and how much is locality pay, but generally, the way he's done it in the past has been about 4.7 for across the board and 0.5 for locality. But we've been pushing for even higher than that. We think that, given inflation and everything, it should be higher. And there's actually a bill in Congress to do 8.7%, which would be a wonderful thing. I think this complicates that a little bit. Congress always can pass something to basically override what the president wants to do. And you'll remember, those who've been around a while, that sometimes that works in our favor and gives a better pay raise, and sometimes that does not work in our favor, and it goes down. So we always are working to push with both the president and with Congress to see if we can get the largest pay raise we can. I do think that it's likely we'll see some push by some to include a lower one in some of the appropriations bills on the Hill this year. And we'll push back against that, and hopefully we'll get at least that 5.2 the president has proposed. But it's not directly impacted by this deal. So it just makes it a little harder because we're looking at lower amounts of money to start.
And during the summer, that's when the budget appropriation bills are coming before the various committees, and that's what you alluded to. So it's a little early in that process, but we'll know more as the months and weeks go along. Would that be
absolutely? Yeah. So sometimes by this point we've seen some of those bills, but because of this debt ceiling debate and the fact that they were trying to tie the amount of funding to this debate, they really couldn't put out those bills until they knew what those funding levels were going to be. So we should start seeing them over the next few weeks, and we will of course be sending information out on what's included in there.
And of course, this debt ceiling legislation impacts IRS. I'm going to turn this over to Duncan Giles for the next question on that issue.
Yeah, the first question before we delve into the pullbacks is, how do you think this is going to affect us for our annual appropriations? Because we've heard in Congress, especially in the last year or so, since the Inflation Reduction Act, that we've gotten these funds. Well, we'll just reduce IRS's budget. Do you think there's still going to be rumblings now that they're going to cut the funding for the IRS because they haven't gotten as much of a pullback that we'll get into in a minute as they wanted to originally?
Yeah, I think we'll still see some push for that. I think that we have some pretty strong arguments against that. I think we have some allies on the Hill who will be pushing very strongly against that. The fact that they've given anything on this, and as you said, we'll get into more about those details, but the fact that they've given any of this funding from the Inflation Reduction Act and let them, kind of take some of that back, I think will be the line for a lot of folks and say, we can't keep cutting this agency. We've been doing that for years. Obviously, IRS funding, as you guys know, has decreased by like 20%. And obviously that impacts many, many things, including staffing and the ability to actually, get these returns processed, help people who are calling for help with their taxes, so many things. And some of those things, customer service in particular, these Congress people hear complaints about a lot from the people they represent. And so, it's not really in their interest to cut a lot of this. They obviously have focused on cutting enforcement. I would guess that's where they will, again, try to do that. I don't think that they will have a whole lot of success with it, but we will be working as if they might, and we will be pushing back against it. And really, it'll be our allies on the Hill that will have to carry that and make sure that they don't do it. And we, from the time this deal started being talked about, we've been already talking with them about that.
And so, since Duncan deferred to me, what I have seen, and I'm an old journalist and political science nerd myself. What I've always found is that when you're talking about the Congress, the House usually is one of those cases where the majority can ride herd over things, and in the Senate things are more relaxed, and a few senators can always gum up the works, and it's just more of a different atmosphere and a different system, if you will, especially with the Senate that's so 51-49 if you look at the people, how they caucus with each other and so forth. So we're dealing with a situation where what I call spin. One side says, "Hey, we got the IRS." And there's certain people in Congress who will love sticking it to the IRS. We stuck it to them in this debt ceiling deal, and that's one spin I'm hearing. Another spin I'm hearing is for the administration, particularly, saying, "Oh, this really isn't going to have much of an impact short term on the IRS as far as the Inflation Reduction Act money, which was meant to kind of fill that gap of funding that's been going on for so many years, as you just alluded to." So I'm going to give you a chance to clear this up. What are the facts? What is the impact on IRS from this debt ceiling legislation?
Well, so let's first talk about what's actually in the deal. So the written deal includes a rescission of only $1.4 billion from the Inflation Reduction Act. And that's relatively small. And I think it was pretty much, if you look at the IRS spend plan, what they were planning to spend on enforcement in the next year. So, or increase enforcement in the next year. So that's an impact, obviously. But the other part of the deal is that they have agreed to repurpose $10 billion each year for the next 2 years of this IRA funding, and put it towards other agencies and other priorities so that they could dull the cuts that other agencies would feel under this debt deal. We're not sure exactly how that works. It's not a written agreement. It's not something they've done a lot in the past. So we're going to be watching carefully to see exactly how this works. But in the end, like you said, this is not the impact that they would have had this bill that the House Republicans passed in April. It would have cut $71 billion of this funding. Or rescinded $71 billion of that IRA funding. So that would have been obviously a devastating impact. What we expect in the short term, as you mentioned, is not a huge impact because the funding from the Inflation Reduction Act, while it was $80 billion approximately over 10 years, it was not given each year. It was given kind of all at once, and they could use it when they wanted to. So the fact that they've lost, some of this money means the rest of it should still be available whenever they want it, which means they can use it now. So this really shouldn't in the short term impact, what they're planning to do, the hiring they're working on and hoping to do. I think they're trying to meet a goal of 10,000 new hires for in 23, the current year, and another 20,000 in 24. And really, this shouldn't impact that. They should be able to do that because that funding is still available whenever they need it. So that's why in the short term, it shouldn't be a problem. Congress, chances are pretty good that the IRS was going to always go back to Congress after some time and need more funding than this 80 billion, because it was, it's rebuilding, but we were, eventually we'd run out of it and we'd need more. And so that was always part of the plan. It might happen a little earlier now because of this, but I think that's more the long-term effect, is that you'll be going back a little faster. And hopefully we will see the IRS able to continue to work on this plan that they've been to modernize, but also to just build up the hiring.
So, Duncan, any questions for Kata on the debt ceiling and the IRS?
Yeah, my thought originally on this, when I saw this, I was like, okay, they're going to be taking, 10 billion this year, 10 billion next year. So almost like missing a year's worth of paychecks. But the way that I understand it now and the way it's been explained, and as you just said, basically we had this $80 billion in savings, a savings account, and now they're going to be taking 20 billion of that away. So we're still going to have that 60 billion that we're able to use right now for, like you said, the hirings for the next 2 fiscal years and more if we need it, and then go back to Congress. So I think that allayed a lot of people's fears, because when I took a look at the original 99-page bill and I sent it to Larry and I said, I've read the whole thing, and the only thing I can see is the same thing that Senator Mike Lee saw, was just the 1.8 billion that was clawed back. So there was a lot of confusion on that. So would my analogy be basically accurate for the IRS? So there's no immediate issues per se.
That's right. I think that's actually a great analogy. It really is more like they had a savings account, and now they have a little less in it, but they're still going to be able to use it over the next number of years, and then they will have to somehow refill it again. But yeah, I think that's right.
Kata, I did see a quote this morning, and I think you've read this as well, Duncan, and I talked about this this morning too, before we started recording, that when you take a look at the Congressional Budget Office analysis of this deal, taking the money away from IRS and looking at what IRS could have additionally raised with the money that they are not going to get, basically you take it all at the bottom line, this deal will rob the Treasury of about $19 billion, which is no small amount.
Well, yeah, actually, I think what they said was that it would increase the deficit by 19 billion. I think that's what you're saying, but it'll increase the deficit by 19 billion because it will result in about 40 billion in revenue that we're not going to take in lost revenue because we're not getting there. So yeah, that's exactly right. And this has been the whole thing with, even as we had the debate over the Inflation Reduction Act, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but when they were trying to take that out of the Inflation Reduction Act, they were losing revenue increased, and they were increasing the deficit. The cost of the bill was going up because the IRS portion of this, investing in the IRS, raises revenues. And so taking money away from the IRS reduces revenues. And that's always been one of the big parts of what we fight for when we fight for increased funding for IRS, whether it was through this Inflation Reduction Act or just through annual appropriations.
My apologies, but we did have a technical glitch toward the end of that podcast, so we didn't get it all in, but I think most of the information was there. I want to thank Kata Sybenga for being with our podcast today, and I also want to thank all of her staff, the many good people working at the NTEU National Office working Capitol Hill on behalf of federal employees. And they do their work all the time, not just when there's a debt ceiling crisis. So thank you once again for watching and listening. Be safe and be kind.